So, hello everyone, my name is Sam Freedman, and I am currently the Director of Research Evaluation and Impact at Teach First, but I want to put one of my old hats on today and talk about policy and the use of research in policy and evidence-based policy. Until February, I was an advisor to Michael Gove. Don't all cheer at once. And I worked for him for about 4 years, both in opposition and then in the Department for Education. So got to know Westminster pretty well. And the thoughts I'm going to share with you today are just my reflections, I guess, on my time there and what it means for how we could use evidence better in policy making. Doesn't just apply to education. Pretty much everything I'm going to say would apply to all Whitehall departments. I don't know if you can see the slide behind me, the placard, but it says, what do we want evidence-based change? When do we want it? After peer review. I just like it. The first thing I want to do is just acknowledge that the evidence-based policy as a concept is quite a complicated one. It's certainly not straightforward. If you're a policymaker, what works is just one of the questions you've got to think about. You've also got to think about all the constraints that are bearing on you. How much money have I got to spend? What's my number one priority? Will something that's worked in one particular field work in the field I'm thinking about? So technically, it's more complicated than just saying, well, let's just find out what works and do that. But the bigger point I wanted to make here is that it can only take you so far, evidence-based policy. I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're not going to sort of find the right policies that everyone's suddenly going to agree around because we're using evidence better. And it's instructive to think about how the concept of evidence-based policy became quite mainstream in British politics. It was only really in the 90s, and it was only really Tony Blair who started using these phrases. And he did it ironically, as a piece of political positioning. What he wanted to do was say, I am not the sort of anti-intellectual Thatcherite ideologue, but equally I'm not a sort of old lefty dinosaur like militant, like some of the people in the unions. He was trying to position himself in the centre ground as a pragmatist. I think the fact that he did that has been very valuable. An evidence-based policy has become a mainstream concept now, and we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't. But at the same time, one of the things it's done is made ideology and some of the values that can sit behind that ideology a very pejorative term. So you'll hear Michael Gove attack the NUT as being ideological, the NUT attack Michael Gove as being ideological. They're both ideological. Everyone in this room is ideological. We all have ideologies. We all have narratives and values that we base our decisions on. And it's actually quite helpful to pretend that there's some sort of perfect position we can get to where we're not doing that. And I found quite useful the work of the American psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book last year called The Righteous Mind, where he talks about some of the underlying morality that sits behind where we are politically on the spectrum between left and right. And he has a theory that there are 5 moral receptors in the same way that you might have taste buds, and that people on the left and right respond differently to or are more concerned about some of those moral receptors than others. Which doesn't mean to say any of them are wrong and any of them are right, but just that people will have a different focus. And he did a really interesting study with some others where they interviewed hundreds of thousands of Americans, gave them some psychometric questions about their moral positioning. And what their sort of theory is that people who are on the left of policy care an awful lot about just 2 of the moral receptors, which are care or compassion and fairness or equality. So over here you can see people who are left-wing are very, very concerned about sort of compassion and equality, much less concerned about his 3 other moral receptors, which are loyalty, authority, and sanctity or purity. Whereas people on the right care about all 5, but they care less about compassion and equality. So, as I was sort of thinking about this slide, it was yesterday. It was while people were debating David Cameron's little speech that he gave at the G20 in defence of Britain, his little Love Actually speech. And all the people on the left in my timeline were basically mocking it and saying, isn't it ridiculous, and why didn't he talk about the NHS, and how is it ever good that slavery was in this country, and maybe we got rid of it, but it's a big deal. Where all the people on the right were saying, this is fantastic, Britain's great. They were pleased about the sort of authority and loyalty sort of moral receptors that was pushing, but people on the left were much more worried about sort of care and equality. So I think the point that Jonathan Haidt was trying to make was that none of these are right and wrong. It's just that people have very different underlying values, and that means when it comes to evidence-based policy, we can try and come to some agreement on what evidence we should be using, maybe even some of its findings, but we're never going to agree on how to interpret that evidence. And that's really important. There is a space for values and for ideology in politics. That's the best place to express them. So the potential for evidence-based policy is limited, but nevertheless, really important that we do our best to have at least a shared conversation about some agreed findings. And now I want to go on to talk about more of the sort of the process issue of having problematized a bit the concept of evidence-based policy, the process issue of how we can do it better in our current political system.